For the purposes of this exercise, I will be using photographic imagery. You will be expected to use the designs you've created in your visual diaries. 3 ways to use Illustrator in the refinement of your design. Let's begin with a square 100 by 100, and let's convert this into a root 2 rectangle by changing the height to 141. For our first design, we'll use the grid tool. So we'll take the dimensions of our rectangle to create a basic grid. So let's just change width and height. So it'll be 100 by 141, of course. We don't want any horizontal lines. We just want some vertical lines. I'm just going to guess something. 20 will do. Okay. We need to ungroup the grid and remove the perimeter or the border around it. Select all the lines so they can be adjusted in weight and in color. Time now to create these white patches that knock out or crop the lines. We'll create a couple of ellipses, and together with Pathfinder or maybe a clipping mask, we can create these negative white spaces. The ellipses will exceed the edges of the format of our root 2 triangle rectangle. So what we need to do is copy the rectangle, paste it over the top of the selection, and then apply the clipping mask, which will crop it down to the border of that rectangle. I'd like to just reduce the size of this design, but before you do, make sure that in your transform selection for scale that you've selected scale, strokes and effects. That has to be on, otherwise you're going to get very thick lines when you reduce this in size. Don't forget to hold down the shift key as you play with proportions. Now for our second design. Let's start with a rectangle again, a root 2 rectangle. Fill it with the appropriate color using the eyedropper. Lock the image layer, then with the pen tool trace the neckline. Once you've enlarged it appropriately, you can go to Pathfinder and subtract the front from the back. Refine your design as necessary and then complete it with a flesh tint. Now for our third image, our third design. Copy your scanned image. We're going to use one of the more exciting tools in Illustrator, the image trace. Before we do, we need to create a clipping mask and then rasterize. We are now ready to use the image trace tool. What this does is change the pixels into vectors. This is a two-step process, first requiring a trace and then the expansion of that trace. But before you expand, you can choose within the tool how detailed this tracing will be. Now it's important to get this right because the more detail you get, and if you have a highly pixelated image, then you're going to get bumps and lumps where you don't want them. So I've gone for fairly simple interpretation of the image, and I should get at least 3 colors out of this. This particular tracing has given me 3 colors, the third being this pink, but really my biggest problem here is that the interpretation of those pixels has caused kind of errors in the way the black and the red relate to each other. I kind of prefer to do the most simplest, the default, which is just a black and white, a very simple interpretation of the pixels. And you don't get too much information, but you can go back into it and modify it yourself. However, I'll just go with this for the purposes of this exercise, but I do have another version of this whereby I've gone to just simple black and white, then gone in manually and changed the color. So that's 3 ways you can use Illustrator to refine your designs. The next thing I'll do is apply the logo and then place these into their final formats.